In his book on the Sabbath, Wayne Mueller tells a story about a family living on the frontier in China during the feudal ages. And one day, for no apparent reason, the son's horse ran away and was taken by a band of nomads who were living across the border. Everyone in the village tried to console the son, saying they were so sorry for his misfortune. But his wise father said, "What makes you so sure this is not a blessing?" The son dismissed him offhand, as sons do with fathers. How could this possibly be a blessing? Well, months later, the horse returned and brought with her a strong stallion. And again, all the neighbors came around who offered consolation from the boy when the horse ran away, this time to offer their congratulations for this incredible stroke of good luck. But the father again paused and said, "What makes you so sure this won't be a disaster?" And again, the son dismissed him. How can this be anything other than a blessing? Well, the horse was strong and helpful for the family's work. They were made wealthy, but the horse was also fast, and the son loved to ride and receive the adulation and praise of all the people in the village. But one day as he was out riding, the horse got startled and the boy fell and broke his hip. And again, the people of the village came around to offer their consolation for this turn of events. And again, the father said, "What makes you so sure this is not a blessing?" And a year later, nomads the ones who stole the horse to begin with, invaded across the border, and every able-bodied man was required to take up his bow and go into the battle. Families on the border where the boy and his father lived lost 9 out of 10 men, but only because the son was injured did father and son live to take care of one another. What appeared at first to only be blessing and triumph often turned out to be a terrible thing. What appeared at first to be a terrible event often contained the seeds of a blessing. And this is a silver thread running throughout Esther's story. It's also one that runs through our lives. And so before we jump into the scripture reading, as we've done a few times already, I want to take a few moments, as I did in 2020, just to acknowledge that there are all kinds of feelings swirling around our city, our church, our families, our algorithms, and they're all bumping into one another. And there are at least 4 levels on which something can be commented upon. There is the emotional, there's the theological, there's the practical, there's the political. But I'm not going to comment on all of those. This is not a Mike St. Dennis sermon. He's not in here. He's not listening. It's okay. But unless you've been doing a complete media embargo over the last 6 months, you've got some feelings. Some of you woke up on Wednesday and all you saw was blessing. Some of you woke up and you fear a curse. Some only thought about Thanksgiving in a few weeks. Some of you have not thought about that until now, and now you're panicking. Sorry. But the point of the parable about the boy and his father is not to deny our emotions. It's not to be naive about the struggles that we face. It's not to be skeptical of the good. It is to walk humbly and to trust in the sovereign hand that is guiding and shaping reality, the fullness of which we can never fully grasp. It's called to be faithful to what is in front of us. And faithfulness requires trusting that God is before all things and reconciling all things to himself by making peace through his cross. Not all at once, but one day, once and for all. And as we've seen in Esther these last 6 weeks, trusting in God's sovereignty also does not eliminate our need to make wise plans. It does not get us off the hook of working for justice, of praying, of providing proactive care for the poor and the vulnerable, of speaking truth in love, of celebrating and encouraging one another. In fact, it means the exact opposite. Trusting in the sovereignty of God means that we are free to embody and experience the reality of his reign in the here and now. And when we don't know the way, to throw ourselves on his grace. That is a calling that does not change no matter what administration is in power. So do this. Feel your feelings. Feel what you need to feel. Invite the Spirit in. But also do this. Don't believe in the lies that tell you that your hope is fulfilled, so now you can just sit back. with lies that tell you that your hope has vanished, and so now it's just time to hunker down. There will only be one administration that brings about the renewal of all things, and until then, we practice his way in the messy space of the now and the not yet. God's mission has not changed. Our world has not fundamentally changed. Our work has not changed. As N.T. Wright says, the nature of faith is to live constantly out of tune with the world as it is presently and in tune with the way God intends it to be. And this is the story we see in Esther. God's people always pressed between two worlds. Dual citizens, resident aliens. The same God is at work holding all things together and moving them inconspicuously toward their appointed ends. And so we pick up this morning in Esther chapter 7. Listen carefully, for you are hearing God's word. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared do such a thing. Esther said, an adversary and enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. And just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen, while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs attending the king, said, a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stand by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. You might not think of yourself as someone who has enemies, but most of us know what it's like to navigate life with people with whom conflict seems inevitable. And as our culture has coarsened around us, the disagreements that we have are increasingly couched in contempt and a posture of moral superiority and marked by the lack of nuanced argument. In public, this looks like trolling and canceling. In private, it's the nitpicking of words, a rolling of the eyes, shaming. A while back, Elizabeth Brunig, who writes some really insightful articles for The Atlantic, tweeted this: there's just something unsustainable about an environment that demands constant atonement but actively dismisses the very idea of forgiveness. I was really struck by that. And ironically, she ended up deleting the tweet because of all the hate she got. You cannot make this stuff up. Psychologists tell us that it takes 5 to 6 positive words to undo the damage of every negative word, and I imagine most of us have people in our lives who have flipped that ratio on its head. And you may not think of them as enemies, but the relationship is marked by enmity. There's those people who think they can only experience happiness when we are experiencing pain. And one of our greatest desires is to experience the presence of shalom, the end of strife, the presence of flourishing. But how do we get there in a world marked by so much relational damage? How do we live at peace with those who treat us like we are enemies? In chapter 5, Esther invites the king and Haman to a second banquet. And you got to know that in ancient Near Eastern cultures, inviting someone to eat with you had way more emotional and cultural capital than it does to us. Way more significance. Particularly inviting them to your own home, to a meal you prepared. It was a way of saying, I want to identify with you. I want to be in relationship with you. And Esther, who we are told in chapter 4 has not been into the presence of the king for 30 days, is very wise and patient about this. She takes the time to reestablish the connection, to move toward him. It's a way of saying, let us rekindle our regard for one another. I mean, we all know what it's like when you get that text or that phone call from someone and they only want something from you, right? So she takes her time. She bypasses that. And having locked in Xerxes' promise to fulfill her desires just by showing up, she also then does not just rush in and tell him exactly what to do. She waits until he's in a good mood, till he's got wine in his hand, and he offers her up to half of his kingdom for a third time. She is threading the needle with guile, with charm, instead of through blunt force trauma. And so Xerxes says, what is your petition? And then he restates it, and what is your request? And it's the same question repeated for emphasis, but Esther pulls it apart. Trial lawyers would appreciate this parsing of words. If I have your favor, that's the premise she sets up. It's reminding him, you chose me, you have an obligation to me. And then finally, after 3 days, she says, here is my petition, save my life. And this would have been a shock. Who has put your life in jeopardy? This would not just be an affront to her, this would be an affront to the king. Who would do this? But then she says, and here's my request. Save my people. By splitting that one question into two, she has identified the fate of her with the fate of her people and vice versa, saying they are the same. What happens to me will happen to them. What happens to them has to happen to me. And it would be impossible at this point for Xerxes to connect the dots back to his decree. But if you were to pull the camera in close on Haman's face, you might see the color starting to drain out a little bit. And the reason it would have been hard for him to make the dots connect initially is because there's a lot of subtlety in the language here that underscores the wisdom with which Esther unravels this whole thing and makes her case. And a lot of that stuff is lost in translation. But if it were a play, we would see it would unfold like this. Here's what she says in verse 4. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had been merely sold as female and male slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. And the reason that is got some ambiguity to it is because the words for enslaved, abad, and destroyed, abad, sound pretty much identical. And if you remember, Haman goes and he speaks to the king when he is presenting his petition. But he's using a word that sounds like destroy, but what the king hears is enslave. And so the king gives him his ring to sign the decree, and Haman can then make it explicit to do whatever he wants. And so Esther is suggesting to her husband that he has been intentionally played, he has been manipulated, he has been lied to. The king thought that Haman was advising them to force these people into service, but Haman was tricking him into signing their death warrant. And this little play on words, he has tricked the king into a murderous edict that would take the life of his very own wife. Not a good look for the king. So it's not just Haman that has done wrong to her, he's done wrong to the king as well. She is uniting their cause into one. And in all this, she is also giving Xerxes plausible deniability. She's giving him an out. She's playing on this constant feature of his personality that he cannot see how his own agency in this situation has allowed events to unfold. He's generally clueless as to what is going on in his kingdom. She says, look, you've just been played. You've been tricked. But she's also playing to his ego. Having gobbled down Esther's retelling of the plot, he is now in the place to be her protector. Who has presumed to do this? And this is the checkmate we've been waiting for. A foe, an enemy, this vile Haman. You can almost see her pointing the finger with her words. And then like a bug pinned and wriggling on a wall, Haman realizes he is doomed. A few minutes later, after the king storms out, puts down his drink. You know he's mad if he puts down his drink. He comes back in, mafia style, places a bag over Haman's head. Not too many stories where that ends up well. And then right around that time, Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, conveniently points out, hey, there's a 6-story torture device hanging out in Haman's front yard. It's like that guy who's only got one line in the entire play, right? And he's just like, I got it. There's a device. There's a spike. I don't know if that information is relevant to you. Xerxes was not asking for it. He's like, it's just some knowledge that I have that I thought I might present to you at this time. And the king says, how fitting. Take him. And like Shakespeare says, Haman is hoist by his own petard. Or like Wile E. Coyote setting a trap for the Roadrunner and being detonated by his own Acme dynamite. Wow. Roadrunner more than Shakespeare? Okay, I see the crowd I'm dealing with here. But because Esther occupies a unique space in the library of Scripture, kind of like a dramatic satire, we're not really allowed to have any sort of sympathy for Haman. At every step, his own pride moves him toward his own destruction. He is the engineer of his own death. And as Haman's wife Zeresh pointed out in the previous chapter, if God's sovereignty guarantees the salvation of his people, it will also guarantee the destruction of those who stand against. And while we can appreciate the irony and the poetic justice, the story also packs a massive theological punch. Biblical scholar Karen Jobes puts it like this: human evil, wherever it occurs and for whatever motivation, always sets itself against God, because God is the definition of goodness and righteousness. Divine justice inevitably and inextricably means the destruction of evil. And the author of Esther shows that evil is personal. It is not some ethereal substance out there. And so while it's true that evil exists in powers and principalities, it's also true that it works through systems and structures that are run by people. And choosing to side with those powers is at the same time choosing to side against a God who is not shy about taking up the cause of the oppressed. And so Haman is put on his own. In Hebrew, interestingly, the word is tree. Some translations have it impaled. Some translations have it hanged. But it could also mean crucifixion. Turns out the Persians were pretty nasty. They did all three. But the point of it is that this great reversal has come about. Esther and Mordecai, who were marked for a curse, are now brought into a place of blessing. Haman, who sought his own blessing, is cursed on the tree of his own ambition. Esther has secured a peace from her enemy. Now, there's still the matter of the decree that has gone out to settle. And while we'll come to that next week, the question remains, how long will this kind of peace last? After all, Moses and David and Joshua and Solomon, they all struggled to secure a temporary peace from their foes, but a new enemy would always pop up. And Haman's death tells us that God is faithful to his covenant, that Esther's people would live and flourish, but before long they are occupied and oppressed by enemies once again, this time not Persians or Babylonians, but Romans. And so the prophets pointed to this day when a Messiah would come and wage war against all evil and injustice and bring shalom. And it's through Esther's wise planning and her humility that the salvation of the world ultimately comes through the salvation of her people. But when that Messiah does come, early in the days of his ministry, the expectation begins to build that Jesus is going to secure this eternal peace just like David did, just like Xerxes does, just like all the other kings, by hanging Romans on their own crosses. And Jesus embraces the role of Messiah, but he stubbornly refuses the tactics. Instead, he would say things to his disciples like, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And he doesn't say that as a threat, just an observation of how a world bent on violence actually works. And his disciples, they do not know what to do with this. They do not know what to make of a Messiah who brings peace any other way than by the sword. So that when the soldiers come and finally get him in Gethsemane, Peter takes out his sword and thinks, this is the moment where we fight for our rest. But instead, Jesus confronts his enemies not by hoisting them on a tree, but by placing himself there and saying, Father, forgive. And it turns out that if we want peace in a world bent on destruction, we have to stubbornly refuse the sword as well. Because Jesus is God's definitive answer to evil. And grace is the ultimate warfare against injustice, the only lasting peace from our enemies. Paul writes in Galatians chapter 3, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For as it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. He redeemed us that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Jesus believed in the justice of God. Jesus is the justice of God, that there is a judgment on evil. Not this enemy or that enemy, but on the enmity within. Not this nation or that nation, but the injustice that is eating at the rind of the world. But the way that Jesus embodies God's justice is not by taking up the sword against a particular set of enemies, but by taking up a cross and going to war against sin and death itself. By taking injustice and its consequences on himself. And so there is this tension. Because Esther's story touches on a nerve, because the natural response of the human heart is for the world to be set to rights. The world has always had its Hamans, it always will. Those whose lust for power and control and incessant need for others to show them respect will lead them to manipulate others and traffic in deception to get what they want. And whether that takes place on the world stage, as it does in Esther, or the small stage drama of family and workplace politics, there is a certain visceral satisfaction we take in seeing our enemies' own weapons turned against them. Because poetic justice serves as this picture of God's final justice at the restoration of all things. But the tension is this. In a world where justice often seems elusive, where the wicked do seem to prosper, how do we resist the temptation of our hearts to seek vengeance and dress it up as if it were justice? Someone wrongs you. Someone hurts your reputation. Everyone would tell you you've got a right to hurt theirs, to get a little bit of your reputation back by dragging them down. Or that if somebody robs you of your happiness, you're within your right to keep them from enjoying a little bit of their own. If you hurt them hard enough, you'll find the rest you're looking for because they'll be gone. But while that might work to disable the enemy, it won't do anything toward the enmity. When you fight evil with evil, evil wins. That's all that's left. When you allow anger and contempt to frame your response, you become bitter, you become colder, you become self-righteous, you become the thing you hate. And any triumph you gain might be temporary, it might give you a high or a little buzz of satisfaction, but it will not create a lasting peace. No, the only way to resist violence in the face of injustice and deception is to trust that there is a God of justice who will make a final end to violence. In his book on forgiveness, Tim Keller notes that the cross changes the fight against evil by offering what he calls the violence of grace. A really interesting phrase when I first read it. But he goes on to describe how it's dramatized in Victor Hugo's famous novel, Les Miserables. You may have know the story or seen the stage musical. It's the story of Jean Valjean, who spends his life mistreated, abused, looked down upon, seen as irredeemable. He's sentenced to 5 years of hard labor for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family, and then another 14 for attempting to escape. And these years of harsh abuse and treatment turn him into a violent and angry man. And because he is denied work, he seeks shelter from a bishop in the village of Dome. And one night, as the bishop is sleeping, Valjean steals his silverware and flees, only to be captured by the police. And the police bring him back to the scene of the crime. They knock on the bishop's door and say, hey, we caught this man. He says that these things were given as a gift, but here is your stuff. And the bishop looks at the police officers and looks at Valjean, and he says, oh, yes, thank you. They were a gift. Thank you for bringing him, because he forgot the candlesticks. And then he looks at Valjean. Did you mean to forget the candlesticks as well? And the police scratch their heads, but they leave. And Valjean looks at his host aghast, and the priest pronounces over him a benediction. You no longer belong to evil, but to good. I have bought your soul for God, so go and be at peace. But these words, he wrestles with them. And as he's leaving, he's disoriented. He's unable to process what just happened. And he's kind of walking around in a daze. And as he's leaving the village, he comes across a young boy who was also walking down the road. And the young boy drops a coin, but Valjean puts his foot on it, just instinctively. And the boy comes up to him, at first playfully, and says, will you please give me my coin? But Valjean freezes and says nothing. And then the boy begins to plead with him, please, sir, give me my coin. But Valjean ignores him. And then the boy gets angry, and Valjean threatens him, and the boy is crying, please, sir, give me my coin. And eventually he runs away. And when Valjean comes to himself and he realizes what he has done, who he has become, he breaks down in tears. Hugo notes it's the first time that he has cried in 19 years. And then he writes this. When Jean Valjean left the bishop's house, he was, as we have seen, quite thrown out of everything that he had been his thought hitherto. Gotta love a good hitherto. He could not yield to the evidence of what was going on within him. He hardened himself against the angelic action and the gentle words of the old man. You have promised me to become an honest man. I buy your soul. I take it away from the spirit of perversity. I give it to the good God. This recurred to his mind unceasingly. To this celestial kindness he opposed pride, which is the fortress of evil within us. He was indistinctly conscious that the pardon of this priest was the greatest assault and the most formidable attack ever sustained on his heart. Faced with the reality of grace, his whole former life begins to fall apart, and he realized that the only choice was either to give himself to this grace or to stand condemned by refusing it. One of the early critics of Hugo's work said that he fundamentally did not understand Christianity, but I think he was on to something. There's nothing more violent than grace. It is traumatic. And the moment that you grasp that you are no longer an enemy of God, it shatters you, but then it begins to put you back together. And it's not easy. Everything in us screams against it. If you're like me, when I am hurt, when I am wounded, when I have been wronged, I do not want grace, I want justice. But the gospel of grace is that I too was once pronounced guilty, but have a God who has been more than patient with me. And that while I was busy plotting a way to work it out on my own, he took the debt entirely. And that is what frees you from self-righteousness, that you are better than those who have wronged you, and it's what grounds you in an identity that you cannot shake. Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf, who lived under a regime of terror and saw the Balkan genocide, captures it well. In light of the justice and love of God, hate recedes and the seed is planted for the miracle of forgiveness. Forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners. But no one can be in the presence of the God of the crucified Messiah for long without overcoming this double exclusion. When one knows that the torturer will not eventually triumph over the victim, one is free to rediscover that person's humanity and imitate God's love for him. And when one knows that God's love is greater than all sin, one is free to see oneself in the light of God's justice and so rediscover one's own sinfulness. And so if you are going to forgive, you must identify with those who have done you wrong. You must realize that they are human just as you are, and that you are sinful just as they are. It's interesting, when I mapped out this series over the summer, I had in mind a very different sermon for this week. I was going to focus, frankly, more on the impaling. But the thing that changed is all the texts and phone calls that I've had, more of them with you than just about any other week since I've been here. Save a week when I was on the phone with a bunch of people from the CDC, my third week here. And I was talking with Kim Hummel, and she said, yeah, I've been looking at this thing under a microscope. It's pretty gnarly. My words, not hers. But most of the conversations this week have been about the pain of family, the pain of unforgiveness. Many of you are carrying around bitter and hurtful exchanges from family members who just think fundamentally differently about the world. Maybe not fundamentally, just differently. For some, you're on the other side of someone whose anger has led them to cut you off. Turns out anger is bipartisan. In one of the conversations this week, I mentioned that a similar thing happened to me in 2020. My dad kept baiting me, and my inner monologue went something like this. Oh, don't take the bait. Don't take the bait. That's bait. Don't take it. Well, no, you can push back gently on this one and then move. Oh, wait, no, you can't. Oh, my God. Oh, no, he has released the Kraken. Abort, abort. He hung up. What just happened? And I started that phone call a 42-year-old. I ended the phone call a 12-year-old. And it sunk me for months. And despite all the time and the healing and the 100 conversations and visits since, on my phone call this week, there was no bait. It was just a straight-up ambush. So I had to flip that relational card that says 200 weeks without incident back to 0. And I'm not telling you this as catharsis. I'm a pretty reserved guy by nature. I just want you to know that I'm with you. I feel it too. And truth be told, our relationship has left a ton of scars, but I would be lying if I didn't tell you that in the moments that have looked like curses, God has done some of the deepest work in me to bring about blessing on the other side. I would be lying if I didn't tell you that was true. And a lot of that is a recognition 20-something years ago that there is no future without forgiveness. So, what I was telling this person is I'm going to call him next week, and I'm going to tell him I love him. And I'm going to show up after Christmas, and I'm going to tell him I love him. And when the cancer that's attacking his body finally gains the temporary W, he is not going to wonder whether that was true. But to do that, I will need to be rooted in an awareness of God's grace toward me, and I will need to reflect that. Friends, it is in the ordinary, routine places like this where the training wheels of discipleship come off. The place where we live out our discipleship is not in the quiet of our prayer closet, but in our relationships with each other. And the way that we know grace is at work in us is the way that it works out of us when we love each other. The only two things that you're going to carry with you into death and the resurrection is the man or the woman that you become in apprenticeship to Jesus and in the relationships you have. But I know it's a tall order, practicing the way of Jesus. Being a community of grace in a culture of judgment, being a community of reconciliation in a culture of division. It is not easy, but it is the only way to find life, and the world desperately needs people to show the way. And if it feels like you, the good news of the gospel is that we have help from the Holy Spirit here and now, and the community of God on your right and on your left. You were made to know God's love. You were born in God's love. You were made to experience and extend God's love. And being rooted in grace is the only way you will be able to resist the temptation to seek vengeance and the power to forgive. And the only way to stop the endless cycle of blessing and curse is to secure a lasting peace. And so, friends, even as we remember this dinner in which Esther prepared a table in the presence of her enemies, we reenact this dinner with Jesus and his disciples, where after the wine was drunk, Jesus told his closest friends that his broken body would be poured out for them, that his blood would be shed for them. And that as we were enemies of God, we have been reconciled to God through his blood on the cross.